I wrote a lot of things that didn't make it in the book because I was like, this is maybe for God's eyes only.
Where did you find the strength to not only write about it, to put it on paper and put it out there for the world to see?
So, Megan Fox wrote a book of poetry. As someone who tries to stay up to date on all the poetry news, this caught my attention. Celebrity poetry is not a new phenomenon, and as you might imagine, the subgenre doesn't have the best reputation. So right off the bat, I can say I appreciate that Megan Fox didn't plaster her face all over this book's cover. It's a pretty neat cover if I'm being honest. Of course, there's a saying about judging books by their covers, so I wanted to get a taste of this book for myself. I ignored all the reviews, threw caution to the wind, went to my local bookstore, and picked up Pretty Boys Are Poisonous. Even though celebrity poetry does have a certain reputation, I tried to be ambitious about this book specifically. I'm not a Megan Fox superfan by any means, but I know that she's been a victim in a lot of ways, to men and the Hollywood complex, and I thought that could make for some interesting writing. Speaking of, I am issuing a content warning here. Most of Megan's poetry deals with intimate partner violence, so if that's not a topic you feel comfortable hearing about, you might want to sit this one out. In a Q&A with Live Signing, Megan said the story of Marilyn Monroe resonated with her, and I would say that's pretty apt, for sure. Megan also suggested that people often underestimate her, which I believe is true in many ways. So with all the potential in the world in her hands, let's see what her collection has to offer. Also, keep in mind, I am not a professional book reviewer by trade, not even a professional poetry reviewer. I'm going to try to be objective about my thoughts here, but well, we'll see how that works out. This book is longer than it looks, at least in terms of page numbers. I was sort of surprised to see a contents section that spanned about 3 pages, and based on the contents, these poems span multiple pages too. And if I'm being honest, some of these titles are so interesting. There's The Indoctrination of a Hopeless Romantic, Lemniscate, and Pomegranates for Sale. I'm not lying when I say these titles intrigued me. Also, this one gave me a chuckle. You'd be so much more handsome if you'd get an exorcism. It's not my favorite title for a poem, but it makes a good one-liner. That being said, some of these titles made me extremely wary, particularly these two. I Would Die for You, oh JK lol, and It's Giving Patrick Bateman. It's not impossible to integrate modern lingo into poems, but as many of you pointed out in the Rupee Core video, it tends to make poems sound very dated in just a matter of years. That said, perhaps it's premature to judge these poems just based on their titles. But before we can get into the poems, there's a preface from the author. Megan Fox informs us, quote, "My healers tell me that my throat chakra is blocked." In my opinion, this makes her sound just slightly out of touch. However, she manages to weave the little intro into something much more grounded and relatable. I was honestly kind of impressed with this preface. It's not Shakespeare by any means, but I liked it. I particularly liked this portion where she says, "This book is for anyone who has given much more than they received, or for anyone who struggles to believe they deserve to be heard." It just felt genuine to me. But I'll be a little more objective from here on out. And unfortunately, I can't say the first poem in this collection left me terribly impressed. And look, it does my favorite thing where it puts the title at the bottom for no reason. Sorry, be more objective, right? I hate to say it, but this just hardly feels like a poem. And what's worse, the premise isn't terrible. I think a better poem would be the story of how the author came to this conclusion. Fortunately, things look up from there. The second poem has a lot more effort on display. The use of words like winsome and diaphanous make the work engaging. The simile is pretty neat too, and the visual of a heart stretching to encapsulate wounds is intriguing as well. That said, the first stanza is more interesting to me than the second. The second feels a little too on the nose and perhaps makes the title feel the same way. That said, it's not that bad. It was at this point that I noticed poems were not printed on pages back to back, as in the two sides of a page are almost never taken up. In the rare instance that a poem spans 2 pages, it's formatted like this, which I suppose makes sense visually, but I really can't express how badly it pisses me off that the pages aren't being used to their fullest potential. And look, I kind of doubt that was even Megan Fox's fault, so I don't even necessarily blame her directly for that. But it just upsets me because, for one thing, it feels like a waste of paper. A common joke I hear among readers is that when a bad book is printed, it means a tree died for nothing. But regardless of whether this book is bad or not, we have to live with the fact that it used more paper than it needed to. And to that point, remember how I mentioned earlier how impressed I was with the length of the contents? This is my other problem. Using only one side of the page means the book is deceptively longer than it actually is. That's such a scummy thing for a publisher to do. You think you're paying for something substantive only to find you're buying half of what appears to be there. Do I sound annoying yet? Because I tend to sound that way when I'm annoyed. You can call this nitpicking, sure, or maybe it was an artistic choice on Megan's part, but it just feels so unjustifiable to me either way. There are 155 pages of this book designated for art. Of those 155 pages, I only counted 24 instances of printing on both sides of a page. In 18 of those instances, one side of the page had text, the other had an illustration. To reiterate, there are only 6 instances of pages having both sides printed with text. We'll come back to these illustrations later, but I just have to stay on this point a little longer. Like, even Insta-poets know to use both sides of the page in a poetry collection. As I mentioned previously, I can't see this as an artistic choice. I see it as a way to artificially inflate the page count, thereby artificially inflating the price. Part of the book's cost is paying for the illustrations, sure, but there are only about 20 pictures. Moreover, using only half of the available page space is extra egregious when so many of the poems don't even cover half the page. A lot of these poems are shorter than 10 lines. Heck, several aren't even 5 lines. Okay, I think I've made my point here. I can confidently say I didn't expect to get this riled up over this book, and my complaints have yet to truly broach the content of the book, so let's get back to the poems. That was a lot of criticism. Let me touch on something I did like. I appreciate Megan's use of biblical and mythological allusions. Some of them are a little half-baked, maybe even a little trite, but the fact that Megan included these motifs throughout the collection shows a measure of intentionality. It shows she's trying, you know, and I do appreciate effort. Here's one use that I found pretty effective, a poem called Lessons in Hot Boy Demonology. I think there are some compelling visuals here, like the cigarette ashes falling into the speaker's eyes, and the soul in the subject's mouth. Those are neat. Side note, ashes and cigarettes are other motifs Megan uses to varying degrees of success, but again, I appreciate that she tries to employ motifs at all. Similarly, I enjoyed the subtle references to werewolves with the mention of silver bullets and the subject turning the speaker into a monster. The poem on the whole isn't the best words in their best order, as Coleridge would say, but it has engaging elements. As for a lot of the more biblically oriented poems, I would classify most of them as good concepts with underdeveloped execution. This one, Leading a Lamb to a Slaughter, I quite liked conceptually. It puts women in the role of Jesus Christ, paying the price for sins they did not commit, then having to forgive those sins, the atonement as it were. I just think the execution is too underdeveloped. These two, I've always liked Serpents and The Truth About Lilith, also had interesting concepts, but the execution mostly lacked all subtlety. Speaking of devices that aren't used to the fullest effect, let's talk about repetition for a second. Repetition is a pretty common literary device, especially in poetry. Megan employs quite a bit of repetition in her work, but it's not great. I see this a lot in amateur poetry online. When a reader sees a lot of repetition in a poem, it's easy for them to just gloss over it, and the repeated words and phrases thereby lose any impact. And granted, I will acknowledge that from a personal standpoint, I just don't like repetition very much. However, I do see the value in it. To me, repetition is at its best in poetry when the repeated phrases take on new meaning with each occurrence. For example, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night by Dylan Thomas. This poem is what we call a villanelle, a poem with 6 stanzas and 3 lines in each stanza, except for the final, which is marked by 4 lines. Repetition is a crucial part of this poetic structure. In a traditional villanelle, the last line of the first stanza is repeated at the end of stanzas 3, 5, and 6, and the last line of the second stanza is repeated at the end of stanzas 4 and 6 as well. In Thomas's poem, the phrases rage, rage against the dying of the light, and do not go gentle into that good night could be easy to tune out the more you read on, but Dylan provides added context between the repetition that creates deeper meaning for those repeated phrases by the end. Megan's attempts at repetition unfortunately don't reach the highs one might hope for from the device. Take this poem, 7, the number of completion. I get that this is another biblical reference, but come on, at least make the repeated phrase something interesting. Or this one, an apparition in a miniskirt. She keeps saying, "I stopped," over and over again, but to what end? The phrase, rather ironically, loses all impact and meaning when used so many times in this way. This one, absolution, is similar. The more Megan says, "girls don't," the more she subverts her own intention. The point, I assume, is to emphasize how men place restrictions on their female partners, but the more the phrase repeats, the less power it has. The emphasis is undermined by the hand-holding, so to speak. Not to mention the lack of consistency, where some lines arbitrarily don't start with "girls don't." Since readers' eyes are trained to look ahead anyway, repetition like this just encourages readers to hurry rather than linger. Staying on the topic of amateurishness, there's also this poem, Karmic Pattern. This is what we refer to as concrete poetry, poetry that forms a shape in its structure. However, the reason for the shape is murky. This isn't the shape of karma. The poem itself references altars, but this isn't the shape of an altar either. This choice feels arbitrary rather than artistic. I've tried to make this review as objective as possible, but I do want to get into a few subjective notes I had while reading. For one thing, I must confess, a few of these poems did leave a lasting impression on me. They caused me to engage in earnest self-reflection about the ways I've treated past partners. And I say this unironically, A+ for emotional resonance. However, that praise goes to the minority of poems, because on the opposite end of the spectrum, most of these poems just totally washed over me. For many, that was thanks to the length. It's hard to make a short poem rich, resonating, and impactful. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but I can't say that Megan manages to achieve such very often. But length isn't the only factor. A lot of these poems just feel very much the same. For example, there are 2 poems that emphasize how the speaker is punished if she laughs at other men's jokes, and that image is used to the same effect in both poems, making both works and visuals feel non-unique. Kind of makes it ironic when Megan says in the author's note that she has multitudinous ways of articulating her feelings. Even in less explicit instances, there wasn't a lot that made individual poems stand out besides the aforementioned uses of motif. Still, many of the poems that employed motif just didn't expand their concepts enough to truly stick out. And this, I feel, is where we should talk about the price. I bought this book at a bookstore for $26. $26. If you look for the book online, it's on sale right now, but you can still see the original price listed at $26. Look, I'm just gonna come out and say it. Almost everything about this book feels like a ploy to artificially inflate the price. There's the previously mentioned underutilization of each page, the fact that the book only comes in hardcover, and, of course, Megan Fox's name on the front. Like I said earlier, I don't necessarily blame Megan for all these decisions. I think she did put a lot of effort into this. Maybe not all her efforts, but there's still some on display. In that Q&A she did with Live Signing, she mentioned how some of the poems in this book are excerpts from text messages, letters, and journals from over the years. And it's not like there's a wrong way to write a poem. I saw this meme just the other day with a text that reads like a poem. However, it's not exactly unnoticeable. A lot of these poems certainly do read like old text messages or resurrected thoughts from a notes application. In this same speaking engagement, Megan also spoke on her poetry influences, naming Charles Bukowski and Amanda Lovelace, and if you've read either of these 2 authors, then you can almost certainly see their influence on Megan's work. If you know me, you'd probably deduce that I'm not a fan of either Bukowski or Lovelace. While on the subject, I'd say Megan's best poems are far better than anything I've read by Lovelace, and more enjoyable to me personally than what I've read from Bukowski. I imagine this book was probably a therapeutic thing for Megan to write. In interviews, she talks about the liberating experience of putting these poems to paper, and that liberation is evident in a few of the works. Of course, that doesn't justify the price tag, and I think we all know for a fact this book wouldn't cost $26 if Megan Fox's name wasn't right there on the cover. In fact, I question whether this book would even be picked up by publishers without the author's renown. On that same day I picked up Megan's book, I also bought Amanda Gorman's collection, Call Us What We Carry. You probably know Amanda Gorman for her inaugural poem, The Hill We Climb, which she delivered at Joe Biden's inauguration. That appearance alone made her one of the most famous poets in the world. Moreover, there is just so much creative, impactful, substantive content on nearly every page of this book. If Megan's book is $26 for 155 pages, then comparatively Gorman's book at 228 pages should be at least $38, right? And that's not even comparing the substantive value, the book jacket, or keeping in mind that Gorman uses the front and back of her pages, so really Gorman's book should be at least $76. But no, I bought Call Us What We Carry for $25, a dollar less than Pretty Boys Are Poisonous. I also bought Milk that same day for $2.87, but that's not really relevant, and frankly, I don't know why I kept this receipt. But come on, even Rupi Kaur's books feel way more reasonably priced than this. Mostly. There is one thing Megan's book has that Gorman's doesn't, and that's illustrations. So, in part, you could argue the drawings are factored into the price. These aren't necessarily my cup of tea, but it would be disingenuous to say they're not good, or at least to say no effort went into them. I might even wager that the artist, Audrey Kawasaki, spent more time on these drawings than Megan did on her poems. That said, there are only about 20 illustrations in the book. Granted, I assume it takes a while for Kawasaki to make these prints. What's more, Kawasaki already had quite a bit of notoriety before working on this book, so her work probably didn't come entirely cheap. I will say the thematic overlap between Kawasaki's art and Megan's writing is appreciated. Still, these illustrations just seem like another price inflator, which is funny because they might have the most value of anything in the book. If I've been too mean, you can let me know. Here are some final thoughts. If you're a fan of Megan Fox, you will probably like this book. If you're someone who wants to better empathize with victims of physical and psychological abuse, you will probably like excerpts from this book. And if you're a person who likes poetry, you will probably like a few pages from this book. That said, I'm not sure anyone should buy this book for $26. As I was putting this video together, Reddit user Danceco112 posted Eat Me by Patience Agbabi on the poetry subreddit, and I thought it was a good example of the type of poetry Megan could strive to create in the future. I'm going to show you the poem, but keeping in line with the warning I gave earlier in the video, this poem deals with topics of partner abuse and could also be triggering for those who have suffered any form of eating disorder or abuse related to food. Once again, if that's content you're not in a place to view right now, skip ahead to this timestamp. The more you read through this poem, the more you understand that it's not literal. While there are people who use food to abuse and control their partners, this poem deals with all forms of abuse, using food as a symbol to do so. Agbabi's poem created a much more visceral reaction in me than any of Megan's, even her description of literal abuse she suffered. To me, Agbabi's poem here is just a testament to what poetry can be. I've talked about it before multiple times, but one of poetry's most important purposes is to say things in new and creative ways. That's one of the great dividers between poetry and prose. As it stands, a lot of Megan's poems just sound too much like prose to truly stand out. Ultimately, I want to end with some advice for Megan, who I'm sure is watching this video. Firstly, Megan, I think you should try more structured poetry. Try and challenge yourself. In this book, there truly are some great instances of diction, rhythm, and word order. I think you can build on that. Try employing meter or specific forms just to get a deeper understanding of poetry, and from there you can experiment more with free verse if you'd like. If you want to take poetry seriously, I encourage you to engage with other writers. Read poetry, diversify your tastes, take writers' workshops, write frequently, the whole shebang. Joining a writer's circle is probably the best thing a writer can do, since writing is just an endless cycle of writing, receiving feedback, then rewriting. Lastly, and I know this might sound crazy, but I just wish the poetry in this book had been more personal. The poems that work here truly work because they feel like your poems and no one else's. Megan, if I'm being honest, I feel like you left a lot of unexplored potential on the table. And don't get me wrong, the poems don't have to be autobiographical or anything like that. But just ask yourself, what is it that separates your poetry from that of any other author? I got a few glimpses into womanhood while reading, and some of those were so powerful. But it also would have been powerful to see those glimpses that only you could show me, as a human, an actress, a Hollywood superstar, and now a poet. But hey, as long as we're discussing feedback, I sure would appreciate it if you, the viewer, including you, Megan Fox, left some feedback on this video. Have you read Megan's book? What did you think of it? What should I do with this book now, because I'm not sure if I want to keep it? What did you think of this video essay? Please tell me everything, and keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft.